My name is Uliana Bridges, I'm 38 years old, and I work at an advertising agency. Our family consists of my husband, David, and our 8-year-old daughter, Mia. We aren't wealthy, but we lead a comfortable life. That's partly because the advertising agency I work for pays well, even compared to my peers with office jobs. I earn a hefty salary, which has always been more than enough to cover our monthly expenses without any worry. We've even managed to save up for Mia's college tuition. Considering the cost of living and our home mortgage, there's always been some extra money left over each month. David was well aware of my high salary, and perhaps his pride was hurt by it. A year ago, David quit his full-time job and started freelancing in web design. He told me he made the switch because he felt he had reached a pay ceiling at his old job, but I was skeptical about how much one could really earn as a freelancer. Of course, I objected when he first told me he wanted to quit. I thought it would be safer for him to stay in his job, secure his full retirement benefits, and then consider other options. However, David was adamant about freelancing, so that's what he did. Ever since he began freelancing, David has been working from home. Perhaps his stated reason for quitting his job was just a cover, and he was really tired of the office politics. Either way, I had to get used to a new routine where David was always at home when I left for work. At first, Mia seemed happy that her dad was always at home when she came back from school. But lately, she had started to complain that he was too busy to play or even talk much during the day. It seemed as though David was there, but not really present. His mind was always absorbed by his screens and the endless flow of clients. That rainy Thursday started like any other day. I was rushing to finish a major campaign proposal when I received a call from Mia's school. There had been an accident during recess, a tragic, unforeseen incident involving a fallen tree branch during the fierce storm that hit unexpectedly. I left the office immediately, my mind reeling, not fully comprehending the gravity of what I had just been told. The drive to the hospital was a blur, the rain pelting relentlessly against the windshield, mirroring the chaos inside me. By the time I arrived, it was already too late. The doctors said there was nothing they could do, Mia was gone. I sat in the hospital, soaked and shivering, numb to the core, until I gathered enough strength to stand and make my way home, to tell David. The image of David's face as I stood in the doorway, breaking the news, would haunt me forever. His initial disbelief, thinking it was a cruel joke, pierced me deeper than the cold had. How could he not see the pain I was in? How could he not immediately feel the gaping hole left by Mia's absence? His detachment only fueled the rage building within me. When he finally understood that this was not a prank, that our little girl was truly gone, his shock seemed feigned, his grief a distant echo of what should have been soul-crushing agony. It was then I realized that something between us had been broken, perhaps irreparably. I made the funeral arrangements with a mechanical efficiency, my heart encased in ice. I instructed David to stay away, to give me space to mourn, to breathe, to exist in this new, hollow reality without his suffocating indifference. His mere presence was a reminder of all that had gone unsaid and undone between us, of the emotional distance that had crept into our marriage, magnified 1,000 times by Mia's sudden death. As I lay in bed that night, the house eerily quiet without Mia's gentle breathing or the soft patter of her footsteps, I made a silent vow. I would not let David forget. I would not let him shrug off his part in our family's disintegration, even if it meant dragging him through the painful truth of our failed responsibilities as parents, as partners. The next morning, I woke up to an empty house. David had taken my words seriously and was nowhere to be seen. In the oppressive silence, I prepared for the days ahead, steeling myself against the waves of grief that threatened to pull me under, determined to face them head-on, with or without David by my side. As I looked at the empty chair across the kitchen table, where Mia used to hum her favorite tunes at breakfast, the reality set in, and the first tear fell. The battle of grief had begun, and I was frighteningly alone. Mia would observe, her young voice carrying a hint of disappointment that she was getting older and seeing more than we wanted her to. "You know, Dad's always glued to his phone," she would say, half to herself, half hoping one of us would listen and recognize the plea for more attention hidden in her words. Despite her age, Mia had always been more perceptive and mature than her classmates. Perhaps it was this maturity that made her sensitive to the growing tension between her parents. Our life, which seemed to roll along without any major issues, began to show its cracks more clearly once David started working from home. I initially hoped this change would allow us to share more family responsibilities. With both of us working, I had always managed the household chores alone, believing it was just the way things had to be. But with him at home, it seemed logical to ask for help. "Can you help with things like cleaning and laundry?" "I'll still cook the meals like I always have," I suggested one evening, trying to keep the tone light and cooperative. David's reaction was not what I expected. "Excuse me, why do I have to do housework? Just because I'm a freelancer doesn't mean I'm not busy. In fact, I've got a lot on my plate." "I can't deal with household stuff on top of that," he retorted, his voice laced with a mix of disbelief and irritation. His response stung me. I understood that freelancing could be more unstable and mentally taxing than a regular salary job. After all, that was one reason I was hesitant about his career shift in the first place. However, household chores were nobody's specific job, and they never had been. "But I work too, you know. It should be equal. You've managed everything by yourself up until now. Don't start complaining now," he argued, his words dismissive, as if the topic was beneath him. In the end, I continued to handle all the household chores as usual. I never assumed he wasn't busy just because he worked from home, but it was hard not to feel resentful when I would come home late at night to find David sprawled in front of the TV or deeply engrossed in his smartphone. "Is dinner ready?" he would ask, as soon as I walked in, his tone expectant, as if it was my sole duty to ensure that meals were prepared on time, regardless of my own exhausting day. His increasing obsession with cleanliness, while refusing to contribute to maintaining it, only added fuel to the fire. He would point out every little speck of dirt on the floor, the smudges on the windows, and the water spots in the bathroom. "If you're so concerned, why don't you clean it up yourself?" I would reply, my patience wearing thin. "I'm only human, I can't get to everything." "You talking back to me? Clean up your own mess. It's our family's home, it's not like I'm the only one making it dirty," I shot back during one of our more heated exchanges. Yet David would go off on these tangents, and I was left utterly baffled by his logic. Mia, witnessing our back and forth, would quietly listen from a distance, absorbing more than any child should. I informed him, my voice trembling with concern. David, usually detached, suddenly seemed alarmed. "She's what?" "Let me see," he said, moving closer to feel Mia's forehead. His expression shifted from indifference to concern, perhaps the most emotion he'd shown in months. It was a stark contrast to the distant figure lounging on the sofa or glued to his phone. "I've got an important meeting today, and I can't miss it. Can you stay with her?" "Please, she needs someone," I pleaded, hoping that today, of all days, he'd step up as a father. David looked at Mia, then back at me, his eyes narrowing as he considered the situation. After a brief pause, he finally nodded. "Okay, I'll stay with her." "You go to your meeting," he said, his tone more gentle than usual. Relieved yet still worried, I quickly prepared a few things for Mia, her favorite blanket, a glass of water by her bedside, and her stuffed bear, to comfort her. I scribbled down the doctor's number and left it on the kitchen counter for David, along with a note about Mia's breakfast and the medicine dosage she would need if her fever didn't subside. Before rushing out, I paused at the doorway of Mia's room, watching David sit by her bed, looking at her with a tenderness that had become rare. It was a glimpse of the man I had married, the father Mia deserved. Racing against the clock, I made it to work just in time for my meeting, but my mind was elsewhere. Throughout the presentation, I kept glancing at my phone, half expecting to see a call from David or the doctor. The mention of a woman's voice on the phone from Mia's observations nagged at me, mixing with the worry for my sick child. Was David truly just busy with work, or was there something more? The suspicion had planted a seed of doubt that seemed to grow with every unexplained absence, and every spritz of cologne on the days he left home dressed unusually sharp. After what felt like the longest meeting of my life, I checked my phone. There were no missed calls, which should have relieved me, but instead, it fueled my anxiety. Why hadn't David called to update me? Was he really taking care of Mia as he promised? The uncertainty was crippling. As soon as the meeting ended, I rushed home, my heart pounding with every mile that brought me closer. When I opened the front door, the house was quiet, too quiet for my liking. I dropped my bag and hurried to Mia's room. There she was, sleeping peacefully, and next to her, David was dozing off in an armchair, his phone on the floor, forgotten. Seeing them like this, a wave of mixed emotions washed over me, relief, gratitude, but still shadowed by the lingering doubts of his fidelity. This day marked a turning point, not just in how I viewed David's role at home, but also in confronting the realities and suspicions that had been building up. I knew that whatever lay ahead, the well-being of Mia would always come first, and decisions, however difficult, would need to be made to protect and nurture her. The complexity of our family dynamics, my career, David's ambiguous actions, and Mia's needs were all threads woven tightly together, creating a tapestry of daily life that was as challenging as it was intricate. The rain was torrential as I rushed Mia inside the house, her body limp in my arms. My heart was pounding as I carefully laid her down on the sofa, wrapping her in the warmest blanket I could find. Her face was pale, her lips a faint blue, and her breaths were shallow and rapid. I tried to wake her gently, "Mia, can you hear me?" But there was no response, just a faint murmur and a slight twitch of her eyelids. I quickly dialed David's number, my hands trembling as I held the phone. It seemed like an eternity before he answered. "David, it's Mia. She's very sick. She was unconscious outside the house when I arrived." "Where are you?" My voice cracked, a mix of fear and desperation, cutting through the stormy noise in the background. I just went out to pick up some prescriptions and grab some fresh air." "I thought she was asleep," David replied, his voice filled with confusion and sudden concern. "There's no time for this, David. Get back here immediately," I said, cutting the call short. I glanced down at Mia, her condition unchanged, and decided I couldn't wait any longer for David. I needed to get her to the hospital right away. I scooped Mia up again, her body still burning hot despite the cold rain, and dashed back to the taxi waiting outside. "To the hospital, fast," I urged the driver, who nodded and immediately pulled away from the curb. As the taxi sliced through the pouring rain, I held Mia close, trying to shield her from the chill. Each minute felt painfully long, and every bump in the road made my heart skip. Mia's breathing was still labored, and she seemed to be slipping further away with each passing second. We arrived at the emergency room, where I carried Mia in, crying out for help. The medical staff reacted quickly, taking her from my arms and rushing her into a treatment area. I followed closely behind, answering their questions about her symptoms and the events of the day as best I could while they hooked up 4 lines and monitored her vitals. The waiting room was cold and sterile, a stark contrast to the chaos of emotions churning inside me. I paced back and forth, trying to piece together how our day had turned so dire. The sound of the rain pounding against the hospital windows added to the eerie atmosphere of waiting and uncertainty. Eventually, a doctor approached me with an update. "She's stable for now, but we're keeping her for observation. She has a severe respiratory infection, and we're doing everything we can to manage her symptoms," he informed me, his voice steady and reassuring. I nodded, barely processing his words, my mind fixated on Mia's pale face and labored breathing. The reality of the situation was overwhelming, and I felt a deep ache for the normalcy of just this morning, which now seemed so far away. As I sat by Mia's bedside, watching her sleep fitfully under the soft hum of medical equipment, I felt alone and adrift. The hospital's fluorescent lights flickered slightly, casting long shadows across the room. I waited for David, dreading and needing the conversation that would follow, all the while holding tightly to Mia's small hand, the steady beat of her pulse under my fingers a small comfort in the storm. I reached our house, my mind a whirlwind of anger and worry. I stepped out of the taxi, my clothes still damp from the rain, and marched straight to the front door. As I unlocked it, I steadied myself for the confrontation with David. He needed to understand the severity of his negligence, and I was determined to make him see that. I opened the door and found the house eerily quiet. Dropping my bag by the entrance, I called out, "David." There was no answer. I walked through the living room, noticing that nothing seemed out of place, yet everything felt wrong without Mia's cheerful presence. I found David in the kitchen, sitting at the table with his head in his hands. He looked up as I entered, his face drawn and pale. "How's Mia?" he asked, his voice cracking with worry. "She's been admitted to the hospital," I said, my tone harsher than I intended. "She was unconscious in front of our house, soaked and feverish. How could you not notice she was outside during the storm? What were you even thinking?" David's eyes widened, and I could see the guilt beginning to form. I thought she was sleeping," he stammered. "I just stepped out for a moment. I didn't realize, I didn't think." "That's just it, David. You didn't think," I cut him off, my anger peaking. "Your daughter needed you, and you weren't there. You were negligent, and it could have cost Mia her life." David lowered his gaze, unable to meet my eyes. "I'm so sorry," he murmured. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." I sighed, my anger mixing with exhaustion. "David, it's not just about making it right. It's about being there, really being there. You can't just tune out the world when you're freelancing or assume that because you're at home, you're present." He nodded slowly, taking in my words. "I know. I've been so caught up in my work. I didn't see how far I drifted from you and Mia. I need to change that. I will change that." Looking at him, I wanted to believe him. I wanted everything to go back to the way it was before all this chaos. But I knew that wasn't possible, not immediately. "We'll see," I said finally. "Right now, I'm going back to the hospital. Mia needs me. We can talk more about this later." I turned to leave, feeling the weight of the day bearing down on me. As I reached for the door, I paused and looked back at David. "This is your wake-up call, David. Don't waste it." With that, I left the house and returned to the hospital, my mind slightly clearer but my heart still heavy. As I sat by Mia's bedside, watching her sleep peacefully under the watchful eyes of the hospital staff, I knew that the road ahead would be difficult. But for Mia's sake, I was ready to face whatever challenges came our way. As Mia recounted her experience, I tried to keep my composure, struggling not to let the anger and hurt show too vividly on my face. "A woman? Can you tell me more about her? What did she look like?" I asked gently, coaxing Mia to continue while ensuring I didn't overwhelm her. "She had long, dark hair and she was wearing a bright red sweater," Mia described, her voice small but clear. "She laughed a lot, and Daddy seemed really happy talking to her. They didn't see me watching them from the hallway." Hearing this sent a chill through me. The idea that David had not only neglected our daughter but entertained someone else in our home while doing so was like a punch to the gut. I held Mia close, my mind racing with the implications of her words. "Did Daddy say her name, or did you hear anything else they talked about?" I continued, trying to gather as much information as possible without alarming her further. Mia shook her head. "No, I didn't hear her name. They were talking about some pictures on Daddy's phone and laughing. Then he saw me and got really mad, saying I should go outside because adults were talking." Mia's voice trembled slightly, revealing the hurt she felt at being dismissed so harshly by her own father. This revelation hardened my resolve. David's behavior was unacceptable, not only as a husband but more importantly, as a father. The safety and emotional well-being of our daughter had been compromised under his watch. "Thank you for telling me, sweetheart. You did nothing wrong, okay? You're the most important thing to me, and I'm here for you," I reassured her, kissing her forehead gently. Mia nodded and snuggled closer, comforted by my presence and the affirmation of her innocence in the disturbing events of the previous day. The joy of her recovery was now overshadowed by the necessity of dealing with the situation at home. After ensuring Mia was settled and comfortable, I stepped outside her hospital room to think. The image of David laughing and chatting carelessly with another woman while our daughter was neglected gnawed at me. I needed to confront David, but I also needed a plan. His disregard for our daughter's safety and well-being was a breach that couldn't be easily forgiven or overlooked. I decided to call a close friend and legal advisor to discuss my options. Legal separation seemed increasingly like the only viable path forward, not just for my peace of mind but for Mia's safety. However, I also had to consider the implications of such a decision, the changes it would mean for Mia's life, and how to manage co-parenting with David if it came to that. As I dialed the number, I took a deep breath, steadying myself for the conversation ahead. The decisions made in the next few days would shape the future for Mia and me, and I was determined to ensure it was a safer, happier one, free from the turmoil and neglect of the past. Walking into the room, the scene before me was almost surreal. David and the woman with the bright red nails sat close together on the edge of our bed, their intimacy palpable in the air, disrupted only by our sudden entrance. The shock on their faces was almost comical, if the situation hadn't been so gravely serious. Mia was supposed to be what? I said, my voice low and controlled, masking the storm of emotions inside me. David stumbled over his words, his face draining of color as he stood up abruptly. I thought you were gone on your trip, and Mia. How is she here? His eyes darted between Mia and me, his confusion turning to panic. Yes, I can see how confusing this must be for you, I replied sarcastically, stepping further into the room, Mia's hand clutched tightly in mine. Especially since you were discussing how fortunate Mia's death was for your new relationship. I watched the woman's face, previously flushed with laughter, now twisted in a mix of fear and embarrassment. David's mistress, now clearly uncomfortable, began gathering her belongings. She muttered something under her breath, a weak attempt to excuse herself from the escalating confrontation. David, however, seemed frozen, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to formulate a response. I didn't wait for him to speak. You threw our daughter out in a storm, David. You locked her out of her own home because you wanted to entertain your mistress. And now, you stand here, talking about her like she's a burden you're glad to be rid of? My voice rose with every word, the fury I had been containing now breaking free. Mia looked up at me, her expression a mix of confusion and sadness. She squeezed my hand, looking for reassurance. I knelt down to her level, my heart breaking at the thought of what she had endured. You're the bravest girl I know, Mia. And I'm so sorry you had to go through this. I hugged her tightly, her presence a bittersweet comfort amidst the chaos. Standing up, I turned back to David. We're not staying here another minute, I declared. I'll be in touch with my lawyer about the divorce and custody arrangements. David finally found his voice, a desperate, pleading edge to it. Please, let's talk about this. It's not what you think. But I was beyond listening. There's nothing left to discuss, David. You've made your choices clear. Turning away, I led Mia out of the room, her small hand gripped firmly in mine. As we walked away, I could hear David calling after us, but the decision was made. There was no going back from this point. As we stepped out of the house, the cool air hit us, and I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. Mia and I had a difficult journey ahead, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of hope. We were together, and that was what mattered. We would rebuild our lives, far away from the lies and betrayal that had tainted our home. As I stood there, holding the business card out to David, his expression was one of shock and realization. He took the card from my hand, his fingers brushing mine as he did so, a tentative gesture that seemed to seek forgiveness. But the time for such gestures had long passed. Unfair? I echoed his earlier protest, my voice steady and firm. What's truly unfair, David, is what you put Mia and me through. You've made your choices, and now you must live with the consequences. David looked down at the scattered photos on the floor, the evidence of his deceit laid bare for all to see. He began to gather them up, his movements slow and defeated. I didn't think it would come to this, he muttered, almost to himself. Well, it has, I replied, my tone resolute. And now, we need to think about the next steps. Mia's well-being is my top priority, and I can't let her be affected by this any more than she already has been. David stood up, the photos clutched in his hands. I know I've messed up. I'm sorry, truly sorry, but I want to make things right, if there's still a chance. Making things right will start with you accepting the consequences of your actions, I told him. You can begin by agreeing to the terms of the divorce amicably. Think of Mia, if not us. We need to handle this as maturely as possible for her sake. David nodded slowly, his eyes meeting mine with a hint of the man I once knew, the one who would have never found himself in such a betrayal. I'll do whatever it takes to make this as right as it can be. For Mia, he said solemnly. I'll be contacting my lawyer tomorrow to discuss the details. I expect you to cooperate fully. I kept my voice firm, leaving no room for negotiation. And about informing your company and your parents, I paused, weighing my words. I will do what must be done to protect Mia and ensure she has the support she needs. This isn't about revenge, it's about responsibility. David's shoulders slumped, resigned. I understand. I'll do my part. And I'm sorry for everything. With that, I turned to leave, Mia's hand in mine. As we walked away from the house we had once called a home, I felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. The road ahead would be challenging, but I knew that with Mia by my side, we could face whatever came our way. As I drove with Mia to my childhood home, the weight of everything that had happened began to settle. I glanced at Mia through the rearview mirror. She was looking out the window, lost in thought. I wondered what she was thinking, how much she understood, and how she was processing everything. Mia, are you okay? I asked, trying to gauge her feelings. She turned to me with a smile, a resilience in her that amazed me every day. Yeah, Mom. I'm okay. I'm glad we're going to Grandma and Grandpa's. Her simple response was filled with relief and anticipation, a stark contrast to the complexity of the emotions I was dealing with. When we arrived, my parents greeted us with open arms and tears. They were furious with David, not just for his infidelity, but for the danger and disregard he had shown towards Mia. My mother, especially, was protective, her instinct to shield both me and Mia from further hurt palpable. We're so glad you're here, safe with us, she said, embracing us both. My father, typically more reserved, had a stern look of disapproval for this situation, but his hug was just as warm. Over the next few days, we settled into a routine at my parents' house. Mia seemed to thrive, enjoying the constant attention and love from her grandparents. Her laughter filled the house, a sound that eased the tension and brought a semblance of normalcy to our disrupted lives. One afternoon, while Mia was drawing in the living room, my mom sat down beside me with a cup of tea. You know, I never liked him much, she confessed, referring to David. But I never thought he'd go this far. How are you holding up, really? I sighed, the weariness of the past weeks catching up to me. It's hard, Mom. But seeing Mia so happy here, it helps. It feels right to be back home. My dad joined us, sitting in his usual chair. He's going to have a tough road ahead, he said, referring to David. But you did what was necessary for Mia. You can't put a price on her safety and happiness. I nodded, grateful for their support. The divorce and the settlement had been messy. David had indeed taken on debt to meet the immediate financial requirements of the settlement. The house was left to him, but so was the responsibility of the mortgage, and without his previous salary, he'd be stretched thin. My old coworker, who kept me updated on David, mentioned how David's lifestyle had drastically changed. He had lost his mistress and was now juggling multiple part-time jobs to stay afloat. Mia, oblivious to these adult concerns, continued to make crafts and drawings, her latest project being gifts for Grandparents' Day. Mommy, do you think Grandma and Grandpa will like these? She asked later that day, showing me her colorful creations. I'm sure they'll love them, I replied, smiling at her enthusiasm. Let's wrap them up nicely and give them later at dinner. As I watched Mia wrap her gifts with meticulous care, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would have its challenges, but with Mia by my side, and the support of my parents, I was confident we could face anything. Moving forward, our pace might be slower, and the journey different from what I had once imagined, but it would be ours, filled with moments of joy and healing.